Life without sanitation. During the bubonic plague, the deadliest year in history. Imagine waking up one morning in a world where the air itself carried the end of everything you knew, where the streets you walked yesterday were now silent, and the neighbors who waved at you last week were gone, simply gone. This is not a horror story. This is not fiction. This is what life looked like when humanity faced its darkest chapter, and the invisible enemy was not just a disease, it was the filth, the ignorance and the desperate silence of a world that had no idea how to save itself. Life without sanitation during the bubonic plague was not just difficult. It was a death sentence, written in the very water people drank, in the very ground they walked on, in the very air they tried to breathe. And the deadliest year in history did not arrive with trumpets or warnings. It arrived quietly, carried on the backs of fleas, hidden in the fur of rats, and spread through the total absence of something we take for granted today, basic cleanliness. This is the story of that year, the story of how the world almost ended, not because of war, not because of famine, but because no one understood the simple, devastating power of washing their hands. The year was 1347, and across the vast stretches of medieval Europe, life moved at a rhythm dictated by seasons, harvests, and the ringing of church bells. In the port cities that lined the Mediterranean coast, traders arrived, daily from the east, their ships heavy with silks, spices, and stories of distant lands. Among those port cities, none was more alive with commerce than Messina, on the island of Sicily. It was October, and the air was thick with the salt of the sea and the noise of merchants haggling over prices. Giovanni De Luca, a 32-year-old dock worker, stood at the edge of the harbor, watching as a fleet of Genoese trading ships slowly made their way toward the port. Giovanni was a simple man. He had a wife, Maria, and 2 young children, a boy of 7 named Pietro and a girl of 4 named Elena. His life was modest but full. He worked the docks from sunrise until his back ached, and he returned home each evening to the smell of Maria's bread baking over the fire. He did not know, as he stood watching those ships approach, that they were carrying something far more valuable than silk, and far more deadly. The ships docked that afternoon, and immediately something felt wrong. The sailors who stumbled off the vessels were not the robust, sun-weathered men Giovanni was used to seeing. These men were pale. Some could barely walk. Others had strange, dark swellings on their necks and under their arms, swellings the size of eggs that seemed to pulse with a terrible heat. The harbor master shouted orders to keep distance, but it was already too late. The cargo had been unloaded. The rats had already scurried into the city. And the fleas, those tiny, almost invisible carriers of destruction, had already found new hosts among the unsuspecting people of Messina. Giovanni helped unload crates that afternoon. He carried sacks of grain and barrels of wine, working alongside men who coughed and sweated beside him. He thought nothing of it. Illness was common among sailors. The sea was harsh, and men often arrived weakened from the journey. That night he went home, kissed his children, and sat down to eat. He told Maria about the strange ships. She crossed herself and whispered a prayer. Neither of them could have imagined what was about to unfold. Within a week, the first residents of Messina began to fall ill. It started with a fever, a burning, relentless heat that seemed to come from inside the bones. Then came the swellings, those terrible dark lumps that appeared in the groin, under the arms, and along the neck. The pain was unbearable. People screamed through the night, their cries echoing through narrow stone streets. And then, within days, they were gone. The speed of it was what terrified people most. A man could be laughing at the market in the morning and be laid out on his bed by evening, his skin turning dark, his breathing shallow, his family standing helpless around him. No one understood what was happening. The physicians of the time had no concept of bacteria, no understanding of how diseases spread. They believed illness came from bad air, miasma they called it, from the alignment of planets, or from the wrath of God. And so, the response was tragically inadequate. People burned herbs and incense hoping to purify the air. They prayed. They flagellated themselves in the streets, believing that physical suffering would appease divine anger. But none of it worked. The sickness spread like wildfire through a dry forest, and the conditions of medieval life were the perfect fuel. The streets of Messina, like those of every major city in Europe at the time, were essentially open sewers. There was no sanitation system. Human waste was thrown directly from windows into the streets below, where it mixed with animal refuse, rotting food, and stagnant water. Pigs, goats, and chickens roamed freely through the same alleys where children played. The water supply came from wells that were often contaminated by the very waste that surrounded them. Bathing was rare. Many believed that opening the pores of the skin through washing actually invited disease. Clothing was worn for weeks, sometimes months, without being cleaned. Homes were cramped, poorly ventilated, and shared by entire extended families, sometimes alongside their livestock. In these conditions, rats thrived. They nested in the thatched roofs, burrowed into the earthen floors, and fed on the endless supply of refuse that lined every street. And where rats thrived, fleas thrived. And where fleas thrived, the bubonic plague thrived. Giovanni watched as his neighborhood transformed. The laughter of children was replaced by the wailing of mothers. The busy market stalls emptied one by one. Doors were marked with crosses, signaling that the sickness had entered that home. Carts rolled through the streets at dawn, collecting the bodies of those who had perished during the night. The smell. Giovanni would never forget the smell. It was a thick, sweet, suffocating odor that clung to everything. The smell of decay, of unwashed bodies, of open wounds, of a city rotting from the inside out. He covered his face with cloth when he walked outside.
Giovanni, please.
But the smell seeped through.
You have to listen to me.
It was in his clothes, in his hair, in his dreams. Maria begged him to take the family and leave. She had heard that the countryside was safer, that the sickness was a curse upon the cities. But Giovanni hesitated. His work was at the docks. Without work, how would he feed his family? And besides, where would they go? The roads were dangerous, filled with desperate people fleeing in every direction, and rumors said that some villages had begun turning away strangers at the point of a blade. So they stayed, and they prayed. And every morning Giovanni checked his children for signs of fever, pressing his calloused hand against their foreheads with a tenderness that broke Maria's heart. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because if you value stories that reveal the raw, unfiltered truth about the moments that shaped humanity, this is the only place you need to be. Subscribe now, so you never miss a single chapter. By the spring of 1348, the plague had crossed from Sicily to the Italian mainland, and from there it spread with a speed that no one could comprehend. It traveled along trade routes, carried by merchants and refugees, fleeing the very death they unknowingly brought with them. It reached Florence, where the great poet Boccaccio would later write about streets filled with the fallen, where the living barely outnumbered the departed. It reached Venice, where the authorities, in a desperate measure, required incoming ships to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark, a practice that gave us the word quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni. But even quarantine was not enough. The plague moved faster than any policy, any prayer, any wall could contain it. It crossed the Alps into France, swept through the Rhineland, and by summer, it had reached England. The medieval world was connected by trade, and that trade network became a highway for destruction. Giovanni and his family survived the winter, but their world had shrunk to the size of their small stone house. Maria rarely left. She kept the children inside, fed them broth made from whatever scraps she could find, and washed the floors with vinegar, an old remedy her grandmother had taught her. Whether it helped or not, no one could say, but the ritual of cleaning gave her a sense of control in a world that had lost all reason. Giovanni continued to work at the docks, though there were fewer and fewer ships arriving. The economy of Messina had collapsed. Markets closed. Tradesmen abandoned their shops. The wealthy fled to their country estates, leaving the poor to fend for themselves in the infected streets. It was a bitter irony that those who could afford to leave were often the ones who spread the disease to new regions, while those too poor to escape were left to endure the full horror of urban conditions. And those conditions, Giovanni could see them deteriorating by the day. With so many workers incapacitated or gone, There was no one to clear the waste from the streets. The refuse piled higher. Rats grew bolder, scurrying openly in daylight. The wells grew fouler. Giovanni noticed that the water had a strange taste, a metallic bitterness that made his stomach turn, but what choice did they have? There was no other source. They boiled what they could, strained it through cloth, and drank it with a quiet desperation. Across Europe, the pattern was the same. Cities without any concept of sanitation became breeding grounds for the plague. In Paris, the Seine River served simultaneously as the city's water supply and its sewer. Butchers dumped offal directly into the water. Tanners released toxic chemicals from their workshops. The people downstream drank, cooked, and bathed in this same water, unknowingly poisoning themselves even before the plague arrived. In London, the situation was equally grim. The Thames was thick with refuse. Streets in the older quarters of the city were so narrow that the upper stories of buildings on opposite sides nearly touched, blocking sunlight and trapping foul air. The lack of ventilation meant that the smell of human and animal waste hung permanently in the air, a dense miasma that people believed was the very source of the sickness. And in a way they were half right, not because bad air itself caused the plague, but because the filthy conditions attracted the rats and fleas that did. The medieval approach to medicine only made things worse. Physicians, known as plague doctors, wore long robes and bird-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing the fragrance would protect them from the miasma. They prescribed bloodletting, the application of leeches, and the lancing of the swollen lumps, practices that often hastened the patient's decline rather than aiding recovery. Some recommended sitting between two large fires to sweat out the illness. Others suggested drinking mixtures of crushed emeralds, gold, and pearls, remedies available only to the wealthy and equally useless to all. There was no understanding of contagion as we know it today. People did not know that the disease was carried by fleas, transmitted through their bites, and amplified by the close quarters and unsanitary conditions in which they lived. They did not know that the simple act of isolating the sick, cleaning their homes, and controlling the rat population could have saved countless lives. Instead, they searched for someone to blame. And blame they did. In many cities across Europe, minority communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells. The accusations were baseless, born of fear and ignorance, but they led to terrible acts of persecution. Entire communities were driven out or worse, scapegoated for a disaster that was, in truth, the result of humanity's own neglect of basic hygiene and public health. Giovanni heard these stories from the few sailors who still arrived at the docks. He heard of cities in the north where entire populations had been wiped out in a matter of weeks. He heard of villages in the countryside where every single inhabitant had perished, leaving behind ghost towns that would not be resettled for generations. He heard of mass graves, dug hastily on the outskirts of cities, where hundreds of bodies were layered one on top of another, covered with thin layers of earth before the next load arrived. And he heard of the desperation of families abandoning their sick, of parents leaving children, of priests refusing to administer last rites for fear of catching the disease themselves. The social fabric of medieval society was tearing apart. The bonds of family, community, and faith that had held civilization together were dissolving under the relentless pressure of fear and loss. Giovanni felt that fear himself. He felt it every time he coughed, every time he noticed a bruise on his arm, every time one of his children complained of a headache. He felt it in the silence that had settled over Messina, a silence broken only by the creak of carts and the distant tolling of church bells. Bells that no longer rang for services, but for the constant, unending procession of the departed. If this story is making you think about the fragile line between civilization and chaos, drop a comment right now saying, "We forget how fragile we are." Let me know you are here. Your voice matters in this community. One evening, as Giovanni sat by the fire, Pietro climbed into his lap and asked a question that nearly broke him. "Papa, is the sickness going to take us too?" Giovanni looked into his son's eyes, wide, dark, filled with a fear that no 7-year-old should ever have to carry, and he said, "No, my son. We are strong. We will be careful. and we will survive this. He said it with a conviction he did not feel, because the truth was, he did not know. No one knew. The plague did not discriminate between the strong and the weak, the rich and the poor, the faithful and the faithless. It came for everyone. And in a world without sanitation, without medicine, without even the most basic understanding of how diseases spread, survival was not a matter of strength or virtue. It was a matter of luck. As the months dragged on, Giovanni began to notice something that would later be recognized as one of the great tragedies within the tragedy. It was not just the plague itself that was destroying lives, it was the collapse of every system that made life possible. With so many workers gone, the fields went unplanted. The harvest of 1348 was a fraction of what it should have been, and by autumn, famine began to stalk the survivors. The price of bread skyrocketed. A loaf that once cost a penny now cost 10. Those who had money hoarded food. Those who did not were left to scavenge, to beg, or to starve. The economic devastation was staggering. Entire trades disappeared overnight. Guilds that had taken centuries to build were wiped out in months. The knowledge and skills of master craftsmen, passed down through generations, vanished with them. In some cities, there were not enough living to maintain even the most basic functions of society. Courts closed. Laws went unenforced. The streets became lawless as desperate people did desperate things to survive. And through it all, the filth only grew worse. Without workers to maintain even the minimal sanitation that existed, the occasional clearing of gutters, the removal of animal carcasses, the maintenance of wells, the cities became increasingly uninhabitable. The stench was overwhelming. In some accounts from the time, writers described how people could smell a city from miles away. The thick, putrid odor carried on the wind like a warning to stay away. Giovanni made a decision that Maria had been urging for months. They would leave Messina. He had heard that some communities in the hills had been less affected, perhaps because their isolation had protected them, perhaps because the cleaner air and water of the highlands offered some defense against the sickness. He did not understand the science behind it. No one did. But the instinct was sound. Distance from the filth of the cities did, in fact, reduce exposure to the rats and fleas that carried the plague. They left at dawn, carrying what little they could. Maria carried Elena on her hip. Pietro walked beside Giovanni, clutching his father's hand. The road out of Messina was lined with abandoned homes, their doors hanging open, their interiors dark and silent. Giovanni saw possessions scattered along the roadside, a wooden cart, a child's toy, a bolt of cloth, belongings dropped by others who had fled before them, too desperate or too weak to carry them further. They walked for 3 days, sleeping in barns and under trees, drinking from streams that flowed clear and cold from the mountains. With each mile they put between themselves and the city, Giovanni felt the weight on. His chest lightened slightly. The air was different here. It did not carry the smell of decay. The water did not taste of metal and rot. There were birds singing, a sound he realized he had not heard in months. They found refuge in a small village called Novara, nestled in the hills above the Sicilian coast. It was a community of perhaps 50 families, mostly farmers and shepherds. They had heard of the plague, of course, but it had not yet reached them. The village elder, a weathered old man, named Tommaso, was cautious about accepting strangers. He questioned Giovanni at length, examined the family for signs of illness, and finally, reluctantly, allowed them to stay in an empty cottage at the edge of the village. Giovanni and Maria scrubbed that cottage from floor to ceiling. They cleared the old straw from the beds and replaced it with fresh. They dug a new pit for waste, far from the well. They kept their food covered and their surroundings clean, not because they understood germ theory, which would not be developed for another 5 centuries, but because Maria had an intuitive sense that cleanliness was connected to health. It was a wisdom born not of education, but of observation. She had noticed back in Messina that the households that kept their homes cleaner, that disposed of their waste more carefully, that kept their food stores sealed against rats, those households seemed to fare better. It was not a guarantee. Nothing was a guarantee. But it was something. And in a world where everything felt random and merciless, something was enough. The village of Novara became a kind of sanctuary. The families there had, by virtue of their isolation and their simpler way of life, maintained a level of cleanliness that was virtually impossible in the dense, overcrowded cities. Their water came from a mountain spring that flowed through clean rock. Their waste was composted in fields far from their homes. Their food was fresh, grown in their own gardens and cooked the same day. They did not live alongside rats and refuse. They lived alongside sheep and olive trees. And while the plague did eventually touch even remote villages like Novara, its impact was significantly less severe. The lesson, though no one was equipped to articulate it at the time, was clear. Sanitation mattered. The conditions in which people lived directly affected their vulnerability to disease. The crowded, filthy cities were not just unpleasant, they were lethal. And the simple practices of clean water, waste disposal, and basic hygiene, practices that would not become widespread for centuries, were the difference between life and a fate no one wanted to face. Giovanni worked the land in Novara. He helped with the harvest, repaired fences, and earned his family's place in the community through sweat and reliability. Pietro began to smile again. Elena learned to chase butterflies in the meadow behind the cottage. Maria baked bread again, and the smell of it, warm, yeasty, alive, filled their small home like a benediction. But Giovanni never forgot. Every night before sleep took him, his mind returned to Messina, to the faces of the people he had known, to the dock workers who had stood beside him, strong and laughing, and were now gone, to the children who had played in the streets, and the mothers who had called them in for dinner, and the old men who had sat on their doorsteps watching the world go by. All gone. Not because of a war, not because of a tyrant, but because the world they lived in was drowning in its own waste, and no one had the knowledge or the will to change it. The bubonic plague, known to history as the Great Pestilence, raged across Europe for roughly 5 years, though it would return in waves for centuries afterward. By the time the initial outbreak subsided around 1353, it had claimed the lives of an estimated 75 to 200 million people, a number so vast that it defies comprehension. In Europe alone, it wiped out between 30 and 60% of the entire population. Cities that had been the jewels of medieval civilization were reduced to shadows of their former selves. The labor shortage that followed was so severe that it fundamentally restructured the economy. Serfs who had been bound to the land and the lords who owned it suddenly found themselves in demand. With so few workers remaining, they could negotiate wages, move freely, and demand better conditions. The feudal system, which had defined European society for centuries, began to crumble. In a strange and painful irony, the great disaster that claimed so many lives also planted the seeds of social change that would eventually lead to greater freedom and rights for ordinary people. But that transformation took generations. The immediate aftermath was chaos, grief, and a profound disillusionment with the institutions that had failed to protect the people. Faith in the church was shaken, as prayers and penances had done nothing to stop the devastation. Trust in physicians was non-existent, as their remedies had proven utterly useless, and the social bonds that held communities together had been stretched to the breaking point by fear, suspicion, and the primal instinct to survive at any cost. Giovanni lived to see the worst of it pass. His family survived, all 4 of them, which was more than most could say. When they eventually returned to Messina years later, the city was almost unrecognizable. Many of the homes stood empty. The docks, once bustling with the commerce of a dozen nations, were quiet. The streets had been partially cleared, but the scars of those terrible years were everywhere. In the boarded-up windows, the overgrown gardens, the memorial crosses that marked the sites of mass graves. Giovanni helped rebuild. It was what he knew how to do. He repaired docks, hauled timber, and slowly, painstakingly, the city began to come back to life. New families arrived, drawn by the availability of land and opportunity. Markets reopened, ships returned, and the cycle of commerce and community resumed, tentatively, like a heartbeat, returning after a long and terrifying silence. But Giovanni carried the lessons of those years deep within him. He insisted that his household maintain the standards of cleanliness that Maria had established in Novara. He dug proper waste pits, kept food stores sealed, and taught his children to wash their hands before eating. These were radical habits for the time, habits that his neighbors found eccentric, even suspicious. But Giovanni did not care. He had seen what happened when people lived in filth. He had smelled it. He had buried friends because of it, and he would not let his family suffer that fate again. The story of the bubonic plague is not just a story about a disease. It is a story about the devastating consequences of living without the basic infrastructure of sanitation. The rats that carried, the fleas that carried the plague thrived in the garbage-strewn streets of medieval cities. The contaminated water weakened immune systems and spread secondary infections. The overcrowded, unventilated homes ensured that once the disease entered a household, everyone within was exposed. Every factor that made the plague so catastrophic was directly connected to the conditions in which people lived. It would take centuries for humanity to fully understand this connection. It was not until the 19th century that scientists like John Snow, Louis Pasteur, and Robert Koch would establish the germ theory of disease and demonstrate that sanitation was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival. The great public health reforms of the Victorian era, the construction of sewer systems, the purification of water supplies, the regulation of food safety, were born directly from the lessons written in the suffering of those who endured the medieval plagues. Today, we live in a world where clean water flows from our taps, where waste is carried away through underground systems we rarely think about, where hospitals maintain sterile environments and vaccines protect us from diseases that once wiped out entire civilizations. We take these things for granted. We flush a toilet without thinking about where the waste goes. We wash our hands as a matter of routine, barely conscious of the simple, life-saving power of that gesture. But every one of these conveniences is a monument to the millions who perished because they did not have them. Every sewer pipe, every water treatment plant, every bar of soap is a silent tribute to Giovanni and Maria and the countless families like them who suffered and endured, and in their suffering taught humanity a lesson it would never forget. Giovanni died in his 60s, a remarkable age for a man of his era and his station. He died in his bed, in the house he had rebuilt in Messina, with Maria at his side and his grandchildren playing in the next room. His life had been one of labor, loss, and quiet resilience. He never knew that the habits of cleanliness he had insisted upon were, in fact, rudimentary public health measures that would one day be recognized as the foundation of modern medicine. He never knew that the instinct that drove him to leave the filth of the city for the clean air of the hills was the same instinct that would, centuries later, lead to the construction of hospitals, the development of antiseptic procedures, and the global campaign to bring clean water to every corner of the planet. He only knew that he had survived, that his family had survived, and that somehow in the midst of the deadliest period in human history, the simple act of keeping things clean had made the difference. Life without sanitation during the bubonic plague was not just uncomfortable. It was a sentence passed upon millions of innocent people by a world that did not yet understand the connection between dirt and disease, between filth and suffering, between a clean well and a living child. The deadliest year in history was not caused by a weapon or a conqueror. It was caused by ignorance, the tragic, heartbreaking ignorance of a world that did not know that the cure for its greatest threat was as simple as clean water and washed hands. And when we look at the world today, at the communities that still lack access to basic sanitation, at the millions who still drink contaminated water and live in conditions not so different from those of medieval Messina, we must ask ourselves, have we truly learned the lesson? Or are we still, in some corners of the world, repeating the same tragic mistakes that turned a manageable disease into the deadliest catastrophe humanity has ever known? Giovanni would have wanted us to remember. Maria would have wanted us to act. And the millions who perished in those dark years, they would have wanted us to know that the line between civilization and collapse is thinner than we think. It is as thin as a layer of soap on skin, as thin as a pipe carrying waste away from a home, as thin as the distance between a well and the nearest source of contamination. That line is sanitation, and when it fails, everything fails with it. That is the lesson of the bubonic plague. That is the lesson of the deadliest year in history. And it is a lesson that, even now, 7 centuries later, we cannot afford to forget. If you watched all the way to the end, it is because this story touched something real inside you. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and see who truly values the stories on this channel. And if this story moved you, hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it helps more people find these stories that deserve to be heard. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who takes the simple things in life for granted, someone who needs a reminder of how far we have come and how much further we still need to go. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe now, because every week this channel brings you the stories that history tried to bury, the stories of real people who lived through the unimaginable, and the lessons that their lives still teach us today. Subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to forget.